The air was thick with a strange stillness as the sun dipped below the horizon. It had been a peaceful day on the rugged coast of Maine, but as twilight deepened, an ominous change swept over the sky. Dark clouds began to gather in the distance, their shapes twisting unnaturally, as if nature itself was preparing for battle. The wind picked up suddenly, whipping across the cliffs and sending a chill through the air. It was the kind of storm that people in coastal towns learned to respect, a storm that could change everything in an instant. Walt Harris, an elderly man in his late 70s, sat by his small window, his hands resting on the worn wooden sill. His cabin, perched on the edge of the cliffs overlooking the sea, had weathered countless storms over the years. But tonight, something felt different. The walls groaned under the weight of the howling wind, and the windows rattled as if in anticipation of the fierce onslaught that was to come. "Beau," Walt muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "Looks like we're in for a rough one, boy." Beau, his faithful golden retriever, was curled up beside him on the floor. The dog lifted his head at the sound of Walt's voice, his golden eyes gleaming in the dim light of the cabin. For a moment, their gazes locked in quiet understanding. Beau had been by Walt's side for nearly a decade, ever since he had been a scruffy, abandoned puppy that Walt had found in the woods one cold winter's night. Over the years, their bond had grown deeper, a bond that no storm could ever break. The storm outside grew stronger with each passing minute, and soon the rain began to pour in sheets, drumming against the roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. The wind howled so violently that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. Walt's old bones ached from the cold, and he pulled the thick woolen blanket closer around his shoulders, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to creep in from every crack in the walls. Beau stood up, stretched, and padded over to the window, where he stood staring out at the raging sea below. The dog's instincts, finely tuned from years of companionship with Walt, sensed that something was wrong. He looked back at Walt, his eyes wide, his tail stiff at the base. Walt could see the unease in his dog's posture, the way his ears were alert and his body tense. "I know, boy. We've been through this before, haven't we?" Walt whispered, his voice carrying a trace of both comfort and sorrow. He had lived a full life, fishing, traveling, and raising a family in this very cabin, but now it was just him and Beau, alone in the world. His wife had passed away years ago, and his children, who had once promised to visit, now lived their own lives far away. The loneliness that settled over Walt at times was palpable, but it was a feeling he had long since accepted. Beau had become his family, his constant companion, and Walt had learned to find solace in the dog's presence. Beau's ears flicked as he turned his gaze back to the window, his body stiffening again. Walt followed his dog's eyes to the horizon, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A flash of lightning illuminated the dark sky, briefly revealing the dark silhouette of a ship struggling against the storm. Walt's heart pounded as he recognized the ship's outline, its sails torn by the fierce wind. It was a fishing boat, likely trying to make it back to harbor before the worst of the storm hit. But then the flash of lightning was gone, and the ship disappeared into the dark. "Beau. Stay close, Beau," Walt said softly. Walt grunted as he pushed himself up from his chair, his stiff joints protesting against the movement. The storm was growing worse, and he needed to check the wooden panels nailed over the windows. The last thing he needed was for the wind to tear them loose and send rain pouring into the cabin. Beau followed close behind, his nails clicking against the wooden floor. The dog's body was tense, his ears flicking at every distant rumble of thunder. Outside, the waves crashed violently against the cliffs, the roar of the sea blending with the howling wind. Walt reached for his thick coat and shrugged it on, the weight of it comforting against his shoulders. "Just a quick check, boy." "Don't worry," he muttered, running a hand over Beau's head before heading for the door. He hesitated for a second, feeling a strange sensation in his chest, tight, heavy, like a fist pressing against his ribs. But he ignored it, shaking his head. Probably just the cold. As soon as he stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked him off balance. Rain pelted against his face, soaking through his thick coat in seconds. He braced himself against the elements and moved along the side of the cabin, gripping the wooden railing of the small porch as he inspected the window panels. Everything seemed secure until a sudden gust of wind ripped one of the boards free, sending it flying into the darkness. Walt cursed under his breath and instinctively moved forward, determined to retrieve it before it disappeared completely. He took one step, then another, then suddenly, his body locked up. A sharp pain shot through his chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. His vision blurred, the world around him tilting. His knees buckled. The last thing he registered was the taste of rain on his lips before the ground rose to meet him. Beau barked, his deep voice cutting through the storm. He ran to Walt's side, nudging at his motionless form with frantic desperation. Walt's breath came in short, labored gasps. His face was pale, his hand twitching slightly in the mud. He tried to speak, but only a weak groan escaped. Beau whined, circling him anxiously. The storm raged on, lightning illuminating the vast emptiness around them. No one else was nearby. No one else would come. For a moment, the dog hesitated, torn between staying and running for help. His instincts screamed at him to protect Walt, to stay by his side. But deep in his heart, Beau knew his owner was in danger. And if no one came soon, it might be too late. With one last nuzzle against Walt's cheek, Beau turned and ran. His paws splashed through the mud as he darted toward the only place where he might find help, the small town beyond the cliffs. The storm raged behind him. Walt lay still, rain pounding against his unmoving body. And Beau, his faithful companion, raced against time. Beau's paws hit the wet ground with a rhythmic determination, his mind focused solely on one goal, finding help. His body moved with the speed and purpose of a creature that had never known fear, but tonight was different. Tonight, the storm had a violent edge, and the wind screamed through the trees like a banshee. Yet, none of it fazed Beau. The only thing that mattered was Walt. As he ran, the familiar smells of the forest and the sea were overwhelmed by the sharp scent of salt water and earth. The rain lashed at his face, but he kept his eyes on the horizon, where the lights of the small town flickered in the distance. His muscles burned, but he pushed forward, driven by a force deeper than his training, deeper than his instincts. His loyalty to Walt surged, overriding every thought of comfort or safety. He had to get help. He had to save him. For Beau, the bond with Walt was unbreakable. It wasn't just the companionship that made them inseparable, but the shared memories, the days spent together on the cliffs, watching the tides change, the quiet moments by the fire. Beau had been Walt's constant companion through thick and thin. From the time he was a puppy, lost and alone in the woods, Walt had taken him in, given him warmth, food, and love. Walt had never asked for much in return. Yet Beau had always been there, loyal and faithful, never questioning the bond they shared. The path leading to town was familiar, but tonight it felt like an endless stretch of waterlogged earth. The rain blurred everything in front of him, but the dog could still hear the faint rumble of the storm and the distant hum of the town. He pressed forward, faster now, his paws skimming over the slick ground with practiced precision. He could feel the tension in his legs building, the cold seeping deeper into his bones with each passing second. But there was no time for slowing down. Walt was in trouble. Walt needed him. Beau's resolve was absolute. He couldn't fail his master. As the town's lights grew brighter on the horizon, Beau's pace slowed just a bit. He needed to focus. His ears twitched, and his nostrils flared as he tried to pick up any sign of life. He could smell people in the air, hear the occasional rumble of voices in the distance, but no one had yet noticed his frantic search. Beau's heart pounded in his chest, not from the run, but from fear of what might be happening to Walt. The rain beat down on him like it was trying to wash away the last bit of his energy, but he refused to stop. His mind raced back to the scene outside the cabin, Walt's pale face, the way he'd collapsed so suddenly, the way the storm raged against them both. Had Walt called for help? Had he been able to do anything? The thought gnawed at Beau as he pushed forward, each step more desperate than the last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the town's dim lights came into full view. The streets were nearly deserted, save for the occasional car passing by, headlights cutting through the downpour. Beau's nose twitched as he reached the first building, a small shop that sold homemade goods. The door was closed, but there was movement inside, and through the rain-streaked window, he could see a shadow. The dog barked, his voice deep and urgent. He wasn't sure who was inside, but he knew that if they didn't hear him, he might never find the help Walt needed. His bark echoed through the storm, bouncing off the walls of the nearby buildings. Inside, the shopkeeper, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair, looked up in surprise at the sound of Beau's frantic bark. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight of the drenched, desperate dog outside her window. She had seen Beau before. He was Walt's dog, the old man who lived on the cliffs, always quiet, always alone. She hurried to the door and threw it open, letting the rain in. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Beau stood still for a moment, soaking wet, but his eyes never left her. His body was tense, his head held high, his eyes pleading. "I need your help," Beau seemed to say with every fiber of his being. The woman stepped back, startled by the intensity in Beau's gaze. She knew Walt was a solitary man, and he wasn't one to seek help unless it was absolutely necessary. She quickly followed the dog's lead, hurrying out into the rain. Beau turned and sprinted forward without a second glance, his body weaving through the downpour, determined to make her follow. She caught up with him quickly, her mind racing as she wondered what could have happened to Walt. "What's going on?" she asked breathlessly, trying to keep up with Beau's fast pace. Beau didn't answer, of course, but he didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any words could. He led her down the narrow streets, through the alleyways, until they reached the foot of the cliffs. She stood there for a moment, taken aback by the sheer force of the storm, but Beau didn't hesitate. He continued forward, never slowing, never looking back. As they reached the base of the cliffs, the woman finally understood what Beau was trying to convey. He wasn't just taking her to the edge of the town, he was taking her to Walt's cabin, to the place where she had last seen the old man. Her heart raced as the weight of the situation sank in. She could see the cabin now, barely visible through the thick curtain of rain, and the ominous feeling in the pit of her stomach grew stronger with each step. She was with Beau now, but would they reach Walt in time? Could the old man survive this storm, alone and injured, waiting for a rescue that might never come? Beau barked sharply, his voice cutting through the storm, urging her on. She pushed forward, trusting the dog with her every step. She had no idea how much time they had left, but she knew this much: if Beau believed there was hope, then she would follow him, no matter what. The rain came down in sheets, blurring everything around them as Beau continued his determined run toward the cabin. The woman, still struggling to keep up with the relentless pace, was beginning to feel the cold seep through her clothes, but there was no time to stop. Beau's urgency only increased, his body surging ahead as if the very earth itself was holding him back. With every step, the storm felt like a looming beast that might swallow them whole, but Beau didn't flinch. His focus was unshakable. As they neared the cabin, the woman, now soaked through and exhausted, noticed something she hadn't before: a faint, distant light glowing from the window of Walt's home. The cabin was small, humble, but that light was like a beacon, offering hope in the midst of the storm's fury. She pushed herself forward, each step becoming harder as the wind howled against her, but she couldn't stop now. She had no choice but to follow Beau. They reached the edge of the property, and Beau halted in his tracks, his golden fur nearly invisible against the rain. His eyes fixed on the cabin with a look of utter determination. He had made it this far, and there was no turning back now. The woman approached slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Walt," she called out, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the storm. There was no response. She tried again, louder this time, but the wind seemed to swallow her words whole. Her throat tightened with panic as she realized that Walt might not be able to hear her, or worse, he might not be conscious at all. She glanced down at Beau, whose posture was tense, his body still as a statue. The dog wasn't moving, but his eyes were locked on the cabin's door, waiting. She could see the faint trembling of his paws, the storm taking its toll on him, but his focus never wavered. He was waiting for her to act. "I'm going in," the woman muttered under her breath. She hadn't come this far just to stand in the rain. She took a deep breath, her lungs filling with the bitter air, and reached for the door handle. The door was unlocked, a blessing in itself given the circumstances. She opened the door cautiously, trying to keep it from creaking too loudly. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, the small fire in the hearth barely visible through the thick haze of smoke that had begun to accumulate. The air inside was thick with the scent of wet earth and old wood. It was warm, but it felt stifling in comparison to the cold wind outside. "Walt," she called, stepping inside. Her voice trembled as she looked around the room, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. There, slumped against the wall near the window, she saw him. Walt was sitting on the floor, his back to the wall, but his body looked unnaturally stiff. His head hung low, his breath shallow, and his face was pale, a stark contrast to the warmth of the fire. His hands were limp in his lap, and his body appeared drained of energy, as though every ounce of life had been sapped from him by the storm itself. Beau, who had followed her into the cabin, padded over to Walt immediately, nudging his shoulder with his snout. There was no response from Walt, no shift in his body. The woman's heart sank as she kneeled beside him, brushing a strand of wet hair from his face. The coldness of his skin sent a shock of fear through her. "Walt, come on," she whispered urgently, her voice desperate as she pressed a hand against his forehead. It was ice cold. He was burning with fever. He hadn't been able to move on his own. She looked around, her mind racing for what to do next. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the room felt too quiet, too still for a man who should have been alive. She needed help, but where could she find it in the middle of such a storm? Her gaze fell on the small cupboard beside the kitchen table. Inside, there were a few first aid supplies, bandages, antiseptic, and some old medication. But this wasn't just a cut or bruise, this was something far more serious. She needed to get Walt out of here, to someone who could help him. He was in no shape to survive this storm on his own. Her mind whirled with thoughts of what to do, and then, as if on cue, Beau whined at her, his golden eyes filled with a quiet urgency. He was the one who had brought her here, and he was the one who would help them both. "Wait," the woman whispered. She stood up abruptly, her eyes locking onto the dog. Beau was still looking at Walt, his head slightly tilted. There was no mistaking it, Beau was waiting for her to act. But what was she supposed to do? In a flash of inspiration, she remembered something. Tom Wheeler, the fisherman who lived on the edge of town, was the closest thing to a medical professional in the area. He was a rugged man, used to handling emergencies, especially the kind of accidents that happened out on the water. If anyone could help Walt, it would be him. But the storm was intense, and it would take hours to reach Tom's house on foot. There was no time to waste. The woman turned toward the door, ready to dash back into the storm, but she stopped as a thought crossed her mind. "Beau," she muttered, looking at the dog. "You know the way." Beau's eyes shifted toward the door, and in that moment, something clicked. He had known that the way to save Walt didn't lie in hesitation, it lay in action. The dog was offering himself as the key to getting help. "All right," the woman said with a firm nod. "We'll go together." She ran back to the door, her hand gripping the handle as she glanced back at Walt one last time. "Hold on, Walt. We're coming back for you." With Beau leading the way, the woman stepped back into the storm. This was no longer a mission to just find help, it was a race against time. Walt's survival depended on her, and now, with Beau at her side, she would not fail. The storm had not let up since Beau and the woman stepped out of the cabin. If anything, it had intensified, the wind howling through the trees like a living thing, the rain coming down in torrents that blurred every shape and shadow. The town's distant lights, once a comforting guide, were now swallowed by the blackness of the night. Every step felt like a battle against the elements, but the woman, with Beau at her side, pressed on. Beau led the way with unwavering determination, his body low to the ground as he navigated through the mud and debris. The dog had always been steady and strong, but tonight, something was different. His fur was matted with rain, his pace relentless, but his eyes shone with an urgency the woman couldn't ignore. She followed him closely, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to keep up. She had to reach Tom Wheeler. She had to make it to him before it was too late. Walt's condition was deteriorating. She could feel it in the stillness that had overtaken the cabin. Walt, strong as he was, couldn't survive much longer without help. As they reached the edge of town, the wind seemed to tear through the streets, tossing debris in every direction. The lights from the small, coastal village were dim and distant, flickering in the storm's fury. She thought of the people in the town. Everyone was either huddled inside, waiting out the storm, or too far away to help. She had no one to turn to but herself and Beau. The woman pushed forward, her hands trembling, her mind focused only on the path ahead. Beau didn't stop. He didn't falter. His sharp nose led him through the rain, his instincts sharper than ever. And then, there it was. The familiar outline of Tom Wheeler's house, a small, weathered building on the edge of the village. The lights inside were on, but there was no sign of movement. Tom was inside, probably unaware of the urgency of the situation. Beau barked sharply, the sound cutting through the storm as the woman rushed toward the door. She knocked frantically, her hand pounding against the wood. "Tom," she shouted over the storm, her voice raw with desperation. "Please, Tom, help." A light flickered inside the house, and soon, the door creaked open. Tom Wheeler, still in his work clothes, looked at her in confusion. His eyes went wide when he saw the look of panic on her face and the dog standing at her side, drenched to the bone. "What's going on?" Tom asked, his voice still heavy with sleep. But the moment his gaze shifted to Beau, and then back to the woman's frantic face, he understood. He didn't need to be told what was wrong. "Walt's down at the cabin," the woman gasped. "He's unconscious, he's burning with fever. We need your help. Now." Without another word, Tom turned and grabbed his jacket. "Let's go." They ran back into the storm, the urgency of the situation now fully understood. Beau, once again, led the way, his powerful legs carrying him swiftly as they followed behind. Walt was still out there, and they were running out of time. The wind howled in their faces as the woman, Tom, and Beau made their way back to the cabin, the storm intensifying with every step. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the sense of urgency pressed down on them like a weight. Each step was a battle against the elements, but the thought of Walt kept them moving forward, driven by a hope that was fragile, yet unwavering. Beau moved ahead, his fur slick with rain, his body tense with determination. The woman followed closely behind, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been so scared in her life. Every second they wasted in the storm felt like a year, and every minute that passed, she feared she might lose Walt. "Come on, Beau," she whispered, almost to herself, trying to muster the strength to keep up. "Please, hurry." They reached the cabin at last, its outline barely visible through the deluge. The door creaked in the wind, and the faint glow of the hearth flickered in the darkness, a single fragile light in the midst of the storm. The woman rushed forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. Beau had already slipped inside, his body a blur in the dark. The woman followed, not even pausing to knock. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and warmth, a stark contrast to the storm outside. Walt was still slumped against the wall, unmoving, his face pale under the flickering light. Tom rushed to his side, kneeling beside him with practiced hands. The woman stood there, helpless for a moment, her eyes locked on Walt's still form. Her heart was pounding in her ears, and she could barely breathe. "Walt," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Walt, it's okay. You're going to be okay." Tom didn't speak as he worked. His hands were quick and efficient, checking Walt's pulse, his temperature, and his breathing. The man had been through a lot in his life, and there was no time for hesitation now. "His fever's high," Tom said, his voice low and calm. "We need to get him warm. Fast." The woman nodded, but her hands were shaking as she fumbled to grab a blanket. Beau, who had never left Walt's side, lay down beside him, nudging him gently with his head. It was as if he was trying to reassure Walt, telling him that help had arrived. The dog's presence was a constant, unspoken comfort. "Hang in there, Walt," the woman whispered as she wrapped the blanket around his frail body. "Just hang on." Time seemed to slow in the cabin. The storm outside raged, but inside, there was a quiet sense of focus. Walt's breath was shallow, his body still burning with fever. The woman kept her hand on his forehead, her fingers cold against his skin, but with every passing second, she felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't gone yet. He hadn't slipped away. There was still time. Then, suddenly, Walt's eyelids fluttered. The woman gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. Beau, sensing the change, let out a quiet whine and pressed closer to Walt's side, as if urging him to open his eyes. "Walt?" she asked again, her voice soft, filled with hope. Walt's eyes slowly opened, just a crack, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. He blinked, then his gaze shifted to Beau. A weak smile crept across his face as he reached out a trembling hand to the dog. "Beau," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You found me." The woman's breath caught in her chest, and she couldn't help but feel a tear slip down her cheek. Beau's tail wagged softly, his eyes full of love and relief. It was a simple moment, but it felt like a miracle. "You're going to be all right, Walt," Tom said, his voice steady as he continued to work. "We'll get you taken care of." And in that moment, surrounded by the howling storm, in the warmth of the small cabin, Walt knew that he was not alone. Not anymore. Beau had found him, and with his loyalty and determination, the dog had brought him back from the edge. The next few days passed in a blur of warmth and quiet recovery. Walt awoke each morning to the comforting crackle of the fire and the persistent, gentle presence of Beau by his side. Tom had stayed to help, tending to Walt's condition with the care of someone used to dealing with the harsh realities of life by the sea. But it was the presence of Beau, his loyal companion, that made all the difference. Walt's fever had broken, and though his body was still weak from the storm and the illness that had overtaken him, there was a new clarity in his eyes. He found himself staring out the window at the rough sea below, the very same sea that had been both his livelihood and his greatest companion. It felt like a lifetime ago when he had been out there on those waters, feeling alive and full of purpose. Now, he realized, he had something even more valuable, a bond. Beau's eyes, full of understanding, met his across the room. The dog had been the one to pull him from the brink, the one who had refused to let him slip away. Beau's loyalty had saved him, and Walt could no longer ignore the truth that had been before him all along. He had lived much of his life in solitude, but now, in this quiet recovery, he realized he had not truly been alone. Not with Beau. The dog had never left his side, had never once given up on him. Walt let out a sigh, a deep, relieved breath. "I don't know what I would have done without you, boy," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Beau wagged his tail, the bond between them stronger than ever. The days following Walt's recovery were filled with quiet moments of reflection. The storm had passed, but the storm inside him had calmed as well. Each morning, as the sun filtered through the cabin's windows, Walt found peace in the steady companionship of Beau, the dog who had saved his life. Walt would sit on the porch, watching the sea, and Beau would rest beside him, his head resting on Walt's knee. The bond between them was deeper than ever, rooted in trust, loyalty, and an unspoken understanding that nothing in this world could sever. No storm, no distance, no time could break the connection they shared. "You've been my strength, boy," Walt murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Beau, as if understanding the weight of the words, nudged his hand, his tail thumping softly against the floor. The old man smiled and ran his fingers through Beau's fur. There was no longer any loneliness in his heart. He had found a companion for life, one who would never leave, never betray. The bond that had been forged over years of shared love and loyalty would never break. They were truly inseparable.